The women had already decided it was a lie before they ever saw the water. They arrived exhausted, underfed, and deeply suspicious. German nurses, auxiliaries, clerks, radio operators, captured late in the war and transported across the Atlantic to American-run prisoner-of-war camps. By the time they reached the United States, most of them had lived for years under bombing, rationing, and collapse. Clean water was rare, soap was rarer, hot water was almost mythical. So when American guards told them they would be allowed to shower, real showers, with unlimited hot water and bars of soap, the women assumed it was a trick. They had been trained to expect tricks. In the final years of the Third Reich, hygiene had become a luxury. Cities were rubble. Infrastructure barely functioned. Water pressure was unreliable. Heating systems destroyed. Soap replaced with harsh substitutes, or nothing at all. Many of these women had washed in rivers, basins, or with cold water pulled from pumps that barely worked. Some hadn't bathed properly in months, others longer. Survival had erased comfort from their expectations. So when they were marched toward a low wooden building inside an American POW camp and told to undress, their instincts screamed danger. Rumors spread immediately that the Americans planned to gas them, that the soap was poisoned, that the water carried chemicals meant to sterilize them, that this was punishment disguised as kindness. These ideas didn't come from paranoia alone. German propaganda had warned constantly about enemy deception. Allied mercy, they were told, was just another weapon. And now, standing on American soil, surrounded by unfamiliar accents and uniforms, the women believed they were finally seeing it in action. The guards didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They didn't force anyone forward. They simply repeated the instruction and waited. That alone unsettled the prisoners. In Germany, orders were barked. Compliance was immediate. Here, the Americans stood back, arms crossed, almost bored. Some even looked uncomfortable. A few women stepped forward cautiously, testing the situation. Others hung back, clutching their coats, whispering to each other. No one wanted to be first. When the first woman turned a metal handle and steam poured into the air, the room froze. The sound alone, rushing water, strong and continuous, felt impossible. Hot water had become a memory from another life. The steam filled the space, carrying a clean, unfamiliar smell. Real soap, not substitute powder, not harsh lye. Actual soap, soft and pale, stacked in crates like it was nothing. Still, many refused to enter. One nurse reportedly crossed herself and stepped back. Another asked if the Americans would still feed them afterward. Several stood rigid, convinced the warmth was temporary, a setup for something worse. The guards exchanged glances, but did not intervene. Minutes passed, then more. The water kept running. Nothing happened. Finally, one woman stepped under the stream. She flinched at first, bracing for pain, for burning chemicals, for punishment. Instead, the water was simply hot, comfortably hot. It soaked into her hair, ran down her shoulders, loosened muscles that had been locked tight for years. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She just stood there, stunned, as soap lathered in her hands like something from before the war. Slowly, the tension in the room shifted. Another woman followed, then another. What happened next was quiet, but profound. Some women cried, not loudly, not dramatically, just tears mixing with water, faces turned away in embarrassment. Others laughed, short bursts of disbelief, as if waiting for someone to shout, "Enough." A few simply stood motionless beneath the streams, afraid that if they moved too much, it would end. Outside, the guards waited, The Americans had not designed this moment as psychological warfare. To them, it was routine. POWs were entitled to hygiene under the Geneva Convention. Clean prisoners meant fewer illnesses, fewer problems. Showers were practical, necessary, normal. But to the women inside, this wasn't normal. It was a rupture in everything they had been taught to believe about the enemy. When they emerged, hair wet, faces flushed, uniforms cleaner than they had been in years, they looked different. Not healthier, not freer, just confused. The camp had not punished them. It had not humiliated them. It had given them something without demanding anything in return. And that unsettled them more than cruelty ever had. That night, whispers spread through the barracks. The water had stayed hot the entire time. The soap hadn't burned. No one got sick. No one disappeared. The showers, it seemed, were real. And that realization raised a far more dangerous question. If the Americans were willing to give this away so casually, water, warmth, dignity, what else had they been lied to about? The showers became routine. That, more than anything, shattered the illusion. Every few days, the women were told they could bathe again. And every time, the same thing happened. Hot water, clean soap, no punishment, no strings attached. What had first felt like an elaborate test slowly revealed itself as policy. Predictable, boring even. The kind of boring that only exists in places where systems actually work. For many of the prisoners, this consistency was harder to process than violence. Cruelty made sense. Deprivation was familiar. But reliability, that contradicted everything the war had taught them. In Germany, nothing was guaranteed. Food changed daily. Water stopped without warning. Bombs erased entire neighborhoods overnight. Here, the taps turned on every time. Some women began saving the soap, breaking bars into smaller pieces, hiding them in clothing or under mattresses. Old habits died hard. Others stopped hoarding altogether, slowly trusting that more would be there next time. That shift, subtle, internal, marked the real turning point. It wasn't the shower itself. It was the realization that the Americans expected the future to exist. The cultural shock didn't end in the washrooms. It spread. Meals were regular. Portions were consistent. Guards ate similar food. Some even complained about it. That alone stunned the prisoners. Complaining meant abundance. It meant choice. It meant the war hadn't consumed everything. Conversations changed too. At first, the women spoke only to each other, guarded, cautious. Over time, they began asking questions, not about escape, about logistics, why the water never ran out, how soap was made, why guards didn't shout, why no one demanded loyalty pledges or political statements. The answers were simple. And that simplicity was devastating, because it suggested the enemy wasn't surviving on desperation. They were functioning. For women raised under constant messaging that Germany was fighting the entire world alone, this realization landed like a quiet collapse. If the Americans could afford hot showers for prisoners, what did that say about the state of the war? About the promises they'd been given? About the sacrifices they'd made? Some resisted the implication fiercely. They insisted the camps were staged, that this was propaganda for show, that somewhere else Germans were being brutalized. But time eroded those defenses. Weeks passed, then months. The showers continued. The food continued. The war moved on. When news of Germany's surrender finally reached the camp, it didn't come with celebration or cruelty. It came folded into routine, an announcement, a change in tone. Nothing dramatic, And that, more than anything, broke the last illusion. There was no revenge waiting, no sudden reversal, just continuation. Years later, many of these women would struggle to explain why something as ordinary as a shower stayed with them longer than air raids or arrests. But the answer was simple. The shower was the moment the war stopped making sense. The moment when the enemy didn't behave like an enemy at all. When the narrative collapsed, not with violence, but with hot water and soap. It wasn't mercy that shocked them. It was normalcy.